The hardest exam I ever passed was not the one that earned my degree. It was the one that taught me whom I was brave enough to love. Those were the first words that escaped my lips as I stood behind the podium inside the packed graduate auditorium at Boston University. Hundreds of faces looked toward the stage, waiting for another speech about academic success, perseverance, and research. Instead, my eyes searched only one row near the back of the room. She was there, smiling with the same quiet warmth that had changed the direction of my life long before anyone realized our story had even begun. For a brief moment, every sound disappeared beneath the applause. The polished wooden stage, the faculty seated in dark academic robes, and the banners hanging from the high ceiling slowly faded into the background. I held the edge of the podium, took a slow breath, and realized that everything standing before me had started with one ordinary afternoon that should have meant absolutely nothing. 1 year earlier, my life had been carefully organized around deadlines, research papers, and impossible expectations. At 28 years old, I was a doctoral candidate in literature, and nearly every hour of my day belonged to my dissertation. My advisor, Professor Richard Sullivan, was respected across the country for his scholarship, and earning a place in his research program had felt like the greatest achievement of my academic career. I admired him deeply, not because he demanded perfection, but because he challenged every student to think beyond obvious answers. That admiration came with pressure. I wanted to prove I deserved to be there, and I believed that meant avoiding every distraction life could possibly place in my path. My apartment overlooked a quiet street in Boston lined with brick buildings and maple trees that glowed beautifully each autumn, yet I rarely noticed them anymore. My mornings began with coffee and journal articles, my afternoons disappeared inside university libraries, and my evenings ended beneath the soft light of my desk lamp surrounded by handwritten notes and towering stacks of books. Friends often joked that I spent more time with 19th century novelists than with living people. They were probably right. I convinced myself that loneliness was simply part of pursuing an ambitious dream. Looking back now, I realize I had confused discipline with emotional distance. Everything changed on a Friday afternoon when the university hosted its annual Arts and Humanities exhibition. Graduate students were encouraged to attend, not because it was required, but because collaboration between departments often sparked new research ideas. I almost skipped the event to continue editing a chapter of my dissertation. At the last minute, I closed my laptop, gathered my notebook, and walked across campus beneath a bright September sky. Music drifted through the courtyard as students, faculty members, and local artists filled the exhibition hall with conversation and laughter. Paintings covered white gallery walls while sculptures, photography collections, and literary displays transformed the familiar building into something entirely new. I wandered through the exhibits without much purpose until someone beside me quietly said, "It is amazing how a single story can make strangers feel like they have known each other forever." I turned toward the voice and met the warm blue eyes of a woman I had never seen before. She smiled with effortless kindness, holding a gallery brochure in one hand and a notebook in the other, and in that completely ordinary moment, without knowing her name or anything about her life, I unknowingly stepped into the first page of a story that would ask me to question everything I believed I understood about love, loyalty, and the future I had planned so carefully. She introduced herself simply as Emma Sullivan, extending her hand with the relaxed confidence of someone who genuinely enjoyed meeting new people instead of collecting polite introductions. I shook her hand and returned my own name without thinking anything of it. She asked what had brought me to the exhibition, and I admitted I was a doctoral student trying to convince myself that attending the event counted as productive research instead of procrastination. She laughed softly, the kind of sincere laugh that immediately dissolved the formal distance people often carried on a university campus. "Sometimes the best ideas arrive when we stop looking for them," she said as we continued walking through the gallery together. We paused in front of a photography collection documenting independent bookstores across New England. Each image captured weathered shelves, handwritten recommendations, and quiet reading corners filled with afternoon sunlight. Emma studied every photograph carefully before explaining that she coordinated cultural programs and community arts events for the university. Her work often connected local artists, authors, students, and faculty members through exhibitions like this one because she believed creativity became more meaningful when it was shared instead of admired from a distance. Listening to her, I found myself speaking more openly than I usually did with someone I had only met a few minutes earlier. We discussed favorite novels, forgotten libraries, and the strange comfort that certain stories continued offering long after people finished reading them. Time seemed to disappear beneath easy conversation. Before I realized it, we had wandered through nearly every exhibit together. Emma noticed details I would have overlooked completely. She admired the handwritten notes displayed beside paintings, thanked student volunteers organizing refreshments, and paused to encourage a nervous young artist presenting her work for the first time. Her kindness never appeared performative. It simply seemed woven naturally into the way she moved through the world. Eventually, we stopped near a large window overlooking the university courtyard where students crossed beneath early autumn trees glowing with shades of gold and crimson. Do you ever spend so much time planning the future that you forget to enjoy the present? Emma asked quietly while watching leaves drift across the brick pathways below. I smiled because the question felt surprisingly personal. That sounds uncomfortably familiar, I admitted. My dissertation has become my entire calendar. She nodded with understanding rather than judgment. Ambition is important, she said. I just hope it always leaves room for the people who unexpectedly become part of the journey. Those words lingered with me longer than I expected. Before we left, she suggested a small independent coffee shop just beyond campus, where visiting artists often gathered after exhibitions. My first instinct was to decline because another chapter of my dissertation waited on my laptop. Instead, something inside me quietly chose a different answer. Over steaming mugs of coffee, we continued talking about literature, childhood memories, and why certain professors changed lives while others only taught classes. Hours passed so naturally that neither of us noticed the evening settling over Boston until the cafe owner began stacking chairs near the front entrance. As we stepped outside beneath the cool September sky, Emma smiled warmly and said, "I hope our paths cross again." I smiled back, believing the university was large enough that the possibility remained uncertain, yet pleasantly possible. We exchanged nothing more than first names before walking in opposite directions through the softly lit campus, completely unaware that fate had already connected our lives far more closely than either of us could have imagined, and that the truth waiting just beyond our next meeting would challenge every boundary I believed I understood. Monday morning arrived with the familiar rhythm of graduate school, carrying the quiet certainty that every hour had already been assigned to research, seminars, and endless revisions. I settled into my usual seat inside Professor Richard Sullivan's advanced literature seminar a few minutes before class began, balancing a notebook filled with annotations beside a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The room slowly filled with doctoral candidates discussing upcoming conferences and dissertation deadlines until Professor Sullivan entered carrying a stack of books beneath one arm. He greeted everyone warmly before launching into a discussion about how great literature often challenged readers to question the assumptions they carried into every chapter of life. His lectures never felt rehearsed. Instead, they unfolded like thoughtful conversations that demanded honesty rather than memorization. I admired that about him, which made what happened after class all the more unexpected. As the final students gathered their belongings, Professor Sullivan asked me to remain for a moment. Assuming he wanted to discuss my latest dissertation chapter, I waited beside his desk while the room gradually emptied. He smiled with the quiet professionalism I had come to respect. "Natalie, I would like your help with an upcoming university cultural initiative," he explained. "The Arts Office is collaborating with our department on a series of literary events, and I believe your research would make an excellent contribution." I accepted immediately, grateful for another opportunity to strengthen my academic experience. He handed me a folder containing the event schedule before adding, "The university's cultural programs coordinator will contact you later this week." I thanked him, slipped the folder into my satchel, and hurried across campus toward the graduate library without giving his final sentence another thought. 2 days later, I arrived at the University Conference Center for the first planning meeting. Faculty members, librarians, student volunteers, and community partners gathered around a long oak conference table covered with notebooks, calendars, and coffee cups. I quietly chose an empty seat near the end of the room just as the door opened once more. The woman who stepped inside instantly brought my attention away from every document in front of me. Emma smiled politely toward the group before taking her place at the front beside the presentation screen. For one brief second our eyes met, and recognition immediately appeared across both of our faces. "It is good to see you again," she said warmly before beginning the meeting. I smiled back, surprised by how genuinely happy I felt to see her. The presentation moved effortlessly through upcoming exhibitions, public lectures, reading festivals, and community outreach programs while Emma guided every discussion with calm confidence. Watching her work was quietly fascinating. She listened carefully to every suggestion, encouraged collaboration instead of competition, and somehow made people from completely different departments feel as though they had always been part of the same team. After the meeting ended, we stayed behind organizing presentation materials together. We laughed about accidentally meeting twice in 1 week and agreed that a university campus had a funny way of bringing people together. Then Professor Sullivan walked into the room carrying another stack of books. He smiled toward Emma with unmistakable familiarity before saying, "Emma, would you mind taking these home for me?" My thoughts froze completely. Emma turned toward me with an expression that mixed surprise and gentle understanding before quietly saying the words that instantly transformed every feeling I had begun allowing myself to explore. "Of course, Dad. I will see you at dinner tonight." In that single moment, I realized the remarkable woman I had begun looking forward to seeing was not simply someone I had met by chance. She was my professor's daughter. For the rest of that afternoon, I moved through campus as though someone had quietly rewritten the rules of a life I had carefully organized for years. Every conversation I replayed with Emma suddenly carried a different meaning. She had never hidden who she was. I simply had never asked the question that would have revealed the answer. By the time I reached my apartment, the excitement I had felt after meeting her had been replaced by a complicated mixture of admiration, disappointment, and caution. Professor Sullivan was not simply another faculty member. He was my dissertation advisor, my academic mentor, and the person whose recommendation could shape the next stage of my career. Crossing any personal boundary connected to his family felt unthinkable, no matter how innocent my feelings seemed. I convinced myself the most responsible decision was also the simplest one. I would remain professional, focus entirely on my research, and allow whatever spark had briefly appeared between Emma and me to quietly disappear before it had the chance to become something more complicated. The following week tested that resolution almost immediately. The cultural initiative required frequent planning sessions, involving faculty, graduate researchers, librarians, and the university arts office. Every meeting placed Emma and me at the same conference table. Every project required us to exchange ideas, review schedules, and coordinate public events together. I responded politely whenever she spoke to me, but I became noticeably more reserved than I had been during our first conversations. Emma noticed the change almost immediately. She never confronted me about it, yet I occasionally caught her studying me with quiet curiosity, as though she sensed an invisible wall had appeared without understanding why. One afternoon we remained behind after another planning meeting to organize volunteer assignments for an upcoming literary festival. We worked side by side in comfortable silence until Emma finally looked toward me with a gentle smile. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded while sorting folders into neat stacks. "Of course." She hesitated for only a moment. "Did I accidentally say or do something that made you uncomfortable?" Her question caught me completely off guard because it was asked without accusation, only genuine concern. I immediately shook my head.
No.
Not at all. She continued watching me with calm patience. Then something changed. I searched for an explanation that would protect both of us without revealing the truth. "Graduate school has become overwhelming," I replied. "I've been trying to stay focused." Emma accepted the answer with a thoughtful nod, although I could tell she sensed there was more beneath the surface. Instead of pressing further, she simply smiled. I hope you remember that focusing on your future does not mean you have to carry every challenge alone." Those words stayed with me long after we left the conference room. Over the following days, I noticed something that made maintaining emotional distance increasingly difficult. Emma treated everyone with the same generosity she had shown me from the beginning. She remembered volunteers' names, encouraged anxious students before presentations, thanked custodial staff after late evening events, and celebrated other people's accomplishments as enthusiastically as her own. None of those moments were dramatic, yet together they revealed the kind of character that quietly earned admiration instead of demanding attention. The harder I tried to convince myself she should remain nothing more than a professional colleague, the more impossible that decision became. Then, late one Friday afternoon, Professor Sullivan asked both of us to join him for a planning session in his office the following Monday. As I agreed without hesitation, I had no idea that meeting would become the first true test of my ability to separate professional responsibility from the feelings I was no longer certain I could keep hidden. Monday morning arrived with clear autumn skies and the crisp air that always seemed to sharpen every sound across the university campus. I reached Professor Sullivan's office a few minutes early, hoping that arriving before everyone else might help settle the restless thoughts that had followed me throughout the weekend. His office overlooked the central courtyard where students crossed between classes carrying backpacks, coffee cups, and stacks of books, completely unaware that the ordinary routines surrounding them often became the setting for extraordinary moments. Shelves overflowing with classic literature lined every wall, while framed photographs from decades of academic conferences reflected the remarkable career Professor Sullivan had built. I was reviewing my notes for the cultural initiative when a soft knock echoed through the open doorway. Emma stepped inside carrying a folder filled with event proposals and greeted both of us with the same warm smile she seemed to offer everyone she met. Despite everything I had promised myself only days earlier, I still found it impossible not to smile back. The planning session focused on organizing a month-long literary festival that would bring together students, faculty, local authors, libraries, and community organizations throughout Boston. Professor Sullivan divided responsibilities carefully before assigning Emma and me to coordinate the keynote exhibition, author discussions, and student volunteer program together. "The two of you complement each other well," he said with complete confidence. "Natalie understands the academic side, and Emma understands how to make people feel welcome. I think you will accomplish something meaningful together." His words were sincere, yet they quietly increased the responsibility I already felt. Once the meeting ended, Emma and I walked toward the university library to review our schedule. The autumn sunlight filtered gently through rows of maple trees while students gathered on the lawn enjoying the unusually warm afternoon. Neither of us mentioned the awkward distance that had existed between us during the previous week. Instead, Emma unfolded the event calendar across a library table and immediately began discussing ideas for interactive reading spaces, community workshops, and student-led discussions. As always, her enthusiasm centered on people rather than logistics. I listened while making notes, occasionally offering suggestions that she welcomed with genuine appreciation. Hours passed surprisingly quickly, and by late afternoon we had completed nearly every major section of the plan. As we packed our folders, Emma smiled and said, "I am glad we are working together. You always notice details that everyone else overlooks." I laughed softly before answering, "You have a way of helping people believe their ideas matter." She paused for a brief moment, almost as though my words had surprised her. "That might be the nicest compliment anyone has given me in a long time," she admitted quietly. We left the library together and walked toward the parking lot beneath trees glowing with brilliant shades of orange and gold. Before we reached the entrance, Emma noticed a first-year student sitting alone on a nearby bench, looking overwhelmed while surrounded by textbooks and loose papers scattered by the wind. Without hesitation, she walked over, helped gather the papers, and spent several minutes encouraging the student through what was clearly a difficult first semester. I remained a short distance away, watching the conversation unfold. The student eventually smiled with visible relief before thanking Emma repeatedly. As we continued walking, I realized something that unsettled me even more than discovering. She was my professor's daughter. Every day I spent beside her made it increasingly impossible to pretend that my growing admiration was simply passing curiosity. I had tried to build emotional distance, yet somehow every shared conversation, every act of kindness, and every ordinary afternoon only brought us closer together, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that my heart had quietly stopped following the careful plans my mind continued trying to make. Over the following weeks, the literary festival gradually became the center of both my professional life and my personal thoughts. Every planning session brought Emma and me together for another afternoon of brainstorming, solving unexpected problems, and refining ideas that would eventually welcome hundreds of students and community members onto campus. What surprised me most was not how efficiently we worked together, but how naturally our conversations extended beyond schedules and logistics. Somewhere between arranging author panels and reviewing volunteer lists, we began sharing the stories that had shaped us long before we met. One rainy Thursday afternoon, the university courtyard emptied as students hurried indoors carrying umbrellas against the steady autumn rain. Emma suggested we continue working inside the historic campus library, where a quiet reading room overlooked the gardens. We settled beside a tall window while raindrops traced slow patterns across the glass, creating the kind of peaceful silence that seemed to invite honest conversation. As we organized event materials, Emma paused while holding a weathered copy of Jane Eyre that had been selected for one of the discussion groups. She smiled thoughtfully before saying, "My father gave me this novel when I was 15. He told me that the strongest people are not the loudest ones. They're the ones who stay true to themselves when life becomes complicated." I looked at the book resting gently in her hands and smiled. "That sounds exactly like something Professor Sullivan would say." She laughed softly. "He probably has said it 100 times. After a brief silence, she looked toward me with quiet curiosity. "What about you? Was there someone who inspired you to study literature?" I leaned back in my chair and thought about a memory I had not revisited for years. "My grandmother," I answered. She worked at a small public library in Vermont. Every Saturday, she let me wander through the shelves until I found a story that felt like it had been waiting just for me. She believed books could teach empathy before they taught knowledge. Emma listened carefully, never interrupting. "I think she was right," she said gently. "The best stories help us understand people we might never become, but somehow still recognize." Hours passed unnoticed while the rain continued falling outside. We drifted from literature to family traditions, childhood dreams, favorite places in New England, and the strange ways people often carried invisible fears without realizing how much they shaped everyday decisions. For the first time in years, I caught myself speaking openly without measuring every sentence beforehand. Emma never rushed my thoughts or tried to impress me with clever answers. She simply listened with complete attention, making even ordinary memories feel worth sharing. As evening approached, the rain finally stopped, leaving the campus wrapped in fresh autumn light. We packed our notes and walked slowly toward the library entrance where golden leaves covered the stone pathways. Before saying goodbye, Emma looked at me with a thoughtful smile. "I feel like I know you much better than I did a month ago." My heart quietly agreed before my mind had the chance to object. "I was just thinking the same thing," I admitted. She hesitated for only a moment before adding, "I hope whatever has been making you keep your distance lately eventually feels less heavy." Those words stopped me completely because they revealed she had understood far more than I ever intended. I watched her walk across the courtyard until she disappeared beyond the old brick buildings, realizing that every attempt to protect my heart had only made one truth impossible to ignore. I was no longer afraid because she was my professor's daughter. I was afraid because I had already begun falling for someone I believed I should never allow myself to love. The literary festival officially opened on the first Saturday of October, transforming the university into a place that felt entirely different from the quiet campus I had come to know through years of research. Colorful banners stretched across brick walkways, local authors greeted eager readers beneath white tents, and families wandered from one event to another carrying books instead of shopping bags. Students volunteered at information tables while musicians performed gentle acoustic sets that blended naturally with the sound of conversations filling the crisp autumn air. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling. Emma moved gracefully through the festival with the calm confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. She welcomed visiting speakers, checked on volunteers, encouraged nervous student presenters, and somehow still found time to stop and speak with every child who approached the reading activities. Watching her reminded me once again that leadership was never about standing in front of people. For Emma, it had always been about standing beside them. My responsibilities kept me occupied with panel discussions and academic presentations throughout most of the morning, but every so often I caught myself searching the crowd for her without realizing I was doing it. It became almost embarrassing how quickly my attention found her in a sea of hundreds of people. Late that afternoon, the final discussion concluded earlier than expected, leaving us with a rare hour before the evening reception began. Emma suggested we take a short walk across the quieter side of campus, where the maple trees overlooked a small reflecting pond hidden behind the humanities building. The festival sounds slowly faded behind us as we followed a narrow stone path covered with brilliant red and golden leaves. "This is my favorite place on campus," Emma admitted with a peaceful smile. "Whenever life becomes noisy, I come here for a few minutes and remember that everything eventually becomes clear if we give ourselves enough quiet." We settled onto a wooden bench facing the water, where gentle ripples reflected the changing colors of the trees above. Neither of us spoke. Immediately, somehow the silence felt more meaningful than conversation. After a while, Emma looked toward me with an expression I had never seen before, one filled with both curiosity and vulnerability. "Can I ask you something honestly?" she said. I nodded. "Always." She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before continuing. "Ever since we discovered who my father is, I have felt you trying to protect yourself from something. I respected your space because I thought you needed time, but I also do not want our friendship to become another thing people quietly abandon because life becomes complicated." Hearing the word friendship unexpectedly tightened something inside my chest. I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to explain that every step backward I had taken came from respecting her father, protecting my academic future, and fearing feelings I never expected to develop. Instead, I simply looked toward the calm water, searching for words that refused to appear. Emma gently smiled, perhaps understanding more than I had managed to say. "You do not have to answer today," she whispered. "I just wanted you to know that whatever is worrying you, it has never changed how much I value knowing you." As we stood to return to the festival, our hands brushed together for only a brief second. Neither of us reached deliberately for the other, yet neither of us immediately pulled away. It was the smallest moment imaginable, lasting no more than an instant, but somehow it carried more truth than every careful conversation we had shared over the past several weeks. Walking back toward the celebration beside her, I realized the greatest challenge before me was no longer admitting what I felt. It was deciding whether I possessed enough courage to let those feelings become part of the future waiting just ahead. The final afternoon of the literary festival arrived with a kind of brilliant October sunshine that made the entire campus feel almost cinematic. Students lingered beneath trees glowing with deep shades of crimson and gold, while visitors filled the final author discussions, poetry readings, and community workshops that had become far more successful than anyone originally expected. Professor Sullivan congratulated our planning team during the morning meeting, praising the collaboration between every department involved. Listening to him, I felt both proud and unexpectedly uneasy. The closer Emma and I had grown over the past several weeks, the more difficult it became to separate my private emotions from my professional responsibilities. I reminded myself that no one else knew what I had been quietly struggling with. At least that was what I believed. Shortly after lunch, Professor Sullivan asked me to walk with him to the university library to review several proposals for expanding the festival into an annual event. We spent nearly an hour discussing funding opportunities, student leadership programs, and possible partnerships with local schools. As always, his guidance was thoughtful and encouraging. Before leaving, however, he paused beside one of the library windows overlooking the courtyard where volunteers continued welcoming visitors. He folded his hands behind his back and smiled thoughtfully. "Natalie," he said, "I have noticed how naturally you and Emma work together. She speaks very highly of you." His words sounded completely innocent, yet my heartbeat quickened almost immediately. I answered carefully. She has been wonderful to work with. The festival would never have succeeded without her. He nodded in quiet agreement before adding, she has always had a remarkable ability to bring out the best in people. There was a brief silence before he continued. You seem happier lately as well. Graduate school can become isolating. I am glad you have found good people to share the journey with. I smiled politely, hoping my expression revealed nothing beyond simple gratitude. We left the library together and returned to the festival grounds where Emma was coordinating the closing ceremony with student volunteers. Throughout the afternoon, I became strangely aware of every small interaction between us. Whenever we exchanged ideas, I wondered whether someone else might notice how easily our conversations flowed. Whenever our eyes met across the crowded courtyard, I found myself looking away a second sooner than usual. The caution that had briefly faded returned with renewed strength. After the final guests departed and volunteers began folding tables, Emma suggested we celebrate the festival's success with coffee before heading home. My first instinct was to accept immediately. Instead, I hesitated. The memory of Professor Sullivan's observations echoed quietly in my mind. Emma noticed my uncertainty almost at once. Long day? She asked gently. I forced a small smile. Something like that. She studied my face for a moment before nodding with quiet understanding. Another time, then. There was no disappointment in her voice, only patience. Watching her walk toward the parking lot, I realized I had unintentionally hurt the one person I least wanted to distance myself from. As I turned back toward the nearly empty courtyard, I saw Professor Sullivan standing beneath the entrance archway speaking with another faculty member. For only a brief second, his eyes shifted toward me and then toward Emma before returning to his conversation. It was probably nothing more than an ordinary glance, yet an uneasy feeling settled deep inside me. For the first time since meeting Emma, I could not escape the quiet suspicion that the boundaries I had tried so carefully to protect might already be far more visible than either of us had ever intended. The days following the festival should have felt like a celebration, yet an uneasy silence gradually settled over every part of my routine. Classes resumed, dissertation meetings continued, and the campus slowly returned to its familiar rhythm after weeks of excitement. But inside me something had shifted. I could not forget the brief look Professor Sullivan had given us before leaving the festival courtyard. It had not been an expression of anger or suspicion. If anything, it seemed thoughtful, almost as though he had quietly noticed something I had spent weeks trying to hide even from myself. The possibility alone was enough to fill every conversation with hesitation. I found myself becoming more careful around Emma again, answering messages later than usual, keeping our meetings focused strictly on university projects, and ending conversations before they naturally would have. Every decision felt reasonable in my mind, yet none of them felt honest. Emma never complained. She simply adjusted to the distance with a grace that somehow made my guilt even heavier. One afternoon, Professor Sullivan invited me to his office to review the latest draft of my dissertation. Our discussion lasted nearly 2 hours as we examined arguments, revised citations, and refined several chapters that were approaching completion. When we finally finished, he leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smile. Your work has matured tremendously, he said. You have grown into exactly the kind of scholar I hoped you would become. Hearing those words should have brought nothing but pride. Instead, they reminded me how much I respected the trust he had placed in me. As I gathered my notes to leave, my eyes briefly settled on a framed family photograph resting near the corner of his desk. Professor Sullivan stood beside a much younger Emma during her college graduation, both of them smiling with unmistakable joy. He noticed where I was looking and smiled warmly. She has always believed the world becomes better when people choose kindness before judgment, he said quietly. I think she learned that lesson from her mother. I smiled politely, but the photograph remained in my thoughts long after I left his office. That evening I wandered through the nearly empty campus before eventually finding myself outside the small coffee shop where Emma and I had shared our first conversation after the exhibition. Through the front window, I saw her sitting alone with a notebook open beside a half-finished cup of coffee. She looked up just as I reached the door and offered the same gentle smile that had first caught my attention weeks earlier. I joined her without thinking. For several minutes, we spoke only about ordinary things, upcoming events, favorite books, and the changing weather, as though neither of us wanted to disturb the fragile comfort of simply being together again. Finally, Emma closed her notebook and looked directly at me. "Natalie," she said softly, I do not need explanations for every quiet moment between us. But I do need honesty. If spending time with me is making your life more difficult, please tell me." Her words left no place to hide. I stared at my untouched coffee before answering with complete sincerity. "Being with you has never been the difficult part." She waited patiently, allowing me to continue. "The difficult part is knowing how much you mean to me while believing I should pretend otherwise." The silence that followed felt impossibly still. Emma's eyes softened with unmistakable emotion, yet before either of us could say another word, my phone vibrated across the table. It was a message from Professor Sullivan asking if I could meet him first thing the next morning because there was something important he wanted to discuss about my future at the university. I barely slept that night. Every possible explanation for Professor Sullivan's unexpected message circled endlessly through my mind, and each one seemed more unsettling than the last. By the time the first light of morning reached my apartment windows, I had already reviewed my dissertation notes twice, without remembering a single sentence I had read. The university campus looked peaceful beneath a pale autumn sky as students hurried toward morning classes carrying coffee and backpacks, completely unaware that my thoughts felt heavier than they had at any point since beginning graduate school. I arrived outside Professor Sullivan's office several minutes early, taking a slow breath before knocking softly on the open door. He welcomed me inside with the same calm professionalism he had always shown, offering a seat across from his desk before setting aside a folder filled with committee documents. For a few moments, we discussed my dissertation schedule, upcoming conference deadlines, and the final revisions expected before my defense. Everything sounded completely ordinary, gradually easing the anxiety I had carried with me all morning. Then Professor Sullivan folded his hands together and smiled thoughtfully. "Natalie, there is another reason I asked you to come today," he said quietly. My heartbeat immediately quickened. "You have become one of the strongest doctoral researchers I have supervised, and I would like to recommend you for a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship next year." For a brief second, relief washed over me so completely that I almost laughed. I thanked him sincerely, overwhelmed by both gratitude and surprise. He nodded warmly before continuing. "The fellowship committee values integrity as much as academic excellence. They often observe how candidates conduct themselves professionally because leadership begins long before titles or awards." His words were perfectly reasonable, yet they carried a weight I could not ignore. I suddenly remembered every conversation with Emma, every shared walk across campus, every careful attempt to protect boundaries that no longer felt as secure as I had once believed. After our meeting ended, I stepped outside into the crisp morning air feeling both encouraged and conflicted. The opportunity Professor Sullivan had described represented everything I had spent years working toward, yet for the first time my future no longer felt defined entirely by academic success. Later that afternoon, Emma asked whether I had time for a short walk before another planning meeting. We crossed the quiet botanical garden near the Humanities building where late autumn flowers still added bright colors to the cool landscape. She immediately noticed something different in my expression. "Your meeting must have gone better than you expected," she said with a hopeful smile. I nodded gently before telling her about the fellowship recommendation. She looked genuinely delighted. "Natalie, that is incredible. You earned every bit of that opportunity." I smiled, but the happiness I expected never fully appeared. Emma noticed. "There is something else," she said softly. I stopped walking and looked toward the small stone fountain at the center of the garden. I keep asking myself whether the life I have planned is forcing me to walk away from the life I actually want, I admitted. Emma remained silent for several moments before stepping a little closer. "Then maybe the question is not whether your dreams are changing," she said quietly. "Maybe the question is whether you finally understand what your dreams have been missing." Before I could answer, she took a slow breath and added with remarkable honesty, "Natalie, I cannot pretend anymore. Somewhere along this journey, you became far more than a colleague or a friend to me." Hearing those words filled me with equal parts hope and fear because they echoed everything I had tried so hard to hide. Yet before either of us could decide what came next, we both heard a familiar voice calling Emma's name from the opposite side of the garden, and when we turned, Professor Sullivan was already walking toward us. Professor Sullivan approached us with the same composed expression he always carried across campus, holding a folder beneath one arm and offering a warm smile that revealed nothing about what he might have seen only moments earlier. Emma and I instinctively stepped a little farther apart, not because we had done anything inappropriate, but because we suddenly became painfully aware of how much remained unspoken between us. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said pleasantly. Emma smiled and shook her head. "We were just finishing our walk before the afternoon meeting." He nodded before turning toward me. "Natalie, thank you again for meeting with me this morning. The fellowship committee will be fortunate to have your application." I thanked him sincerely, still searching his face for some sign that he had noticed the conversation Emma and I had shared. Instead, he continued speaking about the upcoming university symposium and several academic deadlines before excusing himself for another meeting across campus. As he disappeared beyond the garden pathway, both Emma and I released quiet breaths we had not realized we had been holding. Neither of us spoke immediately. The interruption had left our conversation unfinished, but somehow the silence now felt heavier than before. Emma finally looked toward me with thoughtful eyes. "We cannot keep pretending this is only a passing feeling," she said gently. I lowered my gaze toward the fallen leaves scattered across the stone walkway because I knew she was right. "No," I admitted quietly. "We cannot." That evening I returned home carrying more questions than answers. I respected Professor Sullivan deeply, and nothing about this situation changed that truth. He had mentored me with generosity, encouraged my academic growth, and trusted me with opportunities one had once believed impossible. The thought of disappointing him weighed heavily on my heart. Yet another truth had become equally impossible to deny. Every meaningful moment of the past several months had quietly drawn Emma and me closer together through shared values, honest conversations, and genuine friendship that had naturally grown into something deeper. There had been no manipulation, no secrecy, and no intention to cross professional boundaries. Life had simply become more complicated than either of us expected. The following afternoon, Emma asked if we could meet after work inside the quiet reading room of the university library where we had spent so many hours planning the literary festival. As sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, we sat across from one another surrounded by shelves filled with books that had witnessed countless stories before ours. Emma folded her hands together before speaking. "I have been thinking about my father," she said softly. "He has always taught his students that integrity begins with honesty. If we truly respect him, then eventually he deserves the truth rather than silence." I listened carefully, realizing she had reached the same conclusion that had slowly formed in my own mind. "I do not want him to hear anything through rumors or assumptions," she continued. "If there is a difficult conversation ahead, I want it to happen with respect." I nodded slowly. "I agree. But I also think we should wait until my dissertation is complete and I am no longer under his direct supervision. That protects both him and us." Emma smiled with quiet relief. "That is exactly what I hoped you would say." For the first time since our feelings had become impossible to ignore, the future no longer felt defined by fear alone. It still held uncertainty, but it also held a shared commitment to doing what was right. As we stood to leave the library, our eyes met with calm understanding, and without needing another promise, we both knew that whatever came next would be faced not with secrecy or impulsiveness, but with patience, honesty, and the same quiet respect that had brought us together from the very beginning. The weeks that followed became some of the most demanding and meaningful of my life. Every remaining chapter of my dissertation required careful revision, committee feedback, and countless hours inside the graduate library, while the fellowship application demanded equal attention. Emma and I honored the decision we had made together. We continued seeing one another during university events, community programs, and occasional walks across campus, but we remained mindful of the professional boundaries that protected everyone involved. Strangely, the distance did not weaken what we felt. Instead, it strengthened the quiet trust growing between us. Neither of us needed constant reassurance because we had already chosen honesty over impulse. Winter gradually settled across Boston, covering the university grounds with fresh snow that softened every familiar path. One afternoon, after my final dissertation committee meeting concluded successfully, Professor Sullivan invited me into his office. His expression carried the same calm kindness that had guided me since the first semester of graduate school. He congratulated me on completing the final revisions before my dissertation defense and spoke proudly about the scholar I had become. As our conversation drew to a close, I realized the moment Emma and I had anticipated for weeks had finally arrived. I took a slow breath before speaking. Professor Sullivan, there is something important I would like to tell you now that I have completed every academic requirement under your supervision. He looked at me with quiet curiosity and simply nodded, inviting me to continue. I explained everything with complete honesty. I told him that my friendship with Emma had gradually developed during the university cultural initiative, that neither of us had expected those feelings to grow, and that once we understood what was happening, we deliberately chose to maintain professional boundaries until my academic relationship with him had formally ended. I emphasized that protecting the integrity of his mentorship had always remained one of our highest priorities. When I finished speaking, the office became completely silent. Professor Sullivan walked slowly toward the window overlooking the snow-covered courtyard, resting one hand against the bookshelf beside him. After what felt like several long minutes, he turned back toward me with thoughtful eyes. "Natalie," he said quietly, "do you know why I have always insisted that literature matters?" I shook my head gently. He smiled with quiet reflection. "Because every meaningful story asks difficult questions before it offers simple answers." He paused before continuing. "I noticed long ago that something had changed between you and Emma. I also noticed something equally important. Neither of you ever allowed those feelings to interfere with professionalism, respect, or honesty. That told me far more about your character than any explanation ever could." Relief spread through me so unexpectedly that I struggled to find words. He continued speaking with the calm wisdom that had shaped so many students before me. "As your advisor, my responsibility was to protect academic integrity. As Emma's father, my responsibility has always been to hope she finds someone who respects her for the remarkable person she is. Those responsibilities never required me to judge kindness." Tears quietly gathered in my eyes before I thanked him with genuine gratitude. Later that evening, I met Emma beneath the softly illuminated trees outside the university library. Before I could say a single word, she recognized the peaceful expression on my face and smiled with hopeful anticipation. I gently nodded, and without needing a long explanation, she understood everything. Standing together beneath the quiet winter sky, we realized that the future ahead of us had not been built through secrecy or rebellion, but through patience, respect, and the courage to trust that honesty would eventually lead us exactly where we were meant to be. 1 year later, I stood once again beneath the warm lights of the university auditorium, but everything inside me had changed. The room was filled with faculty members, graduate students, visiting scholars, families, and community partners who had gathered to celebrate another year of academic achievement. Large windows allowed the afternoon sunlight to spill across polished wooden floors while banners honoring graduating doctoral candidates hung proudly from the balcony above. My dissertation had been successfully defended months earlier. The fellowship had become the beginning of a new chapter in my academic career, and the literary festival that Emma and I had helped create had officially become an annual tradition embraced by the university and the surrounding community. Looking around the auditorium, I realized that every dream I had once believed impossible had quietly become part of my everyday life. Yet none of those accomplishments compared to the lesson I had learned about love, integrity, and courage. As I waited to deliver the keynote address for the incoming graduate students, My eyes naturally searched the audience until they found the two people who had shaped my journey more than anyone else. Professor Richard Sullivan sat proudly beside Emma, both of them smiling with the quiet confidence that only genuine understanding can bring. The sight still amazed me. Not because everything had become perfect, but because every difficult conversation had been met with honesty instead of fear. When the applause settled, I stepped toward the podium and looked across the sea of hopeful faces preparing to begin journeys of their own. The most important discoveries you make at a university may never appear inside a textbook. I began. Sometimes they arrive through unexpected conversations, difficult choices, and the people who quietly challenge you to become a better version of yourself. As I spoke, I realized those words were no longer simply part of a prepared speech. They had become the truth of my own life. After the ceremony ended, families gathered throughout the courtyard taking photographs beneath flowering trees while professors congratulated graduates and students embraced friends who had shared years of hard work together. Emma found me near the stone steps leading toward the library where our story had unfolded so naturally over the previous year. She smiled before gently taking my hand, no longer worried about who might see us because there was nothing left to hide. Together we walked slowly across the familiar campus, passing the exhibition hall where we had first met, the coffee shop where endless conversations had turned strangers into trusted companions, the quiet reading room where honesty replaced uncertainty, and the garden where we had finally admitted what our hearts had known long before our words could express it. Every place held a memory, and every memory reminded me that the most meaningful journeys rarely follow the careful plans we create for ourselves. As we reached the overlook beside the Charles River, I paused for a moment to watch the afternoon sunlight shimmer across the water. Emma smiled and asked, "If you could return to the day we first met, would you change anything?" I thought about every challenge, every moment of doubt, every difficult decision, and every lesson that had led us here before answering with complete certainty. "Not a single page," I said softly, because every chapter taught me something I needed to learn before I could truly appreciate the ending. Emma smiled with quiet warmth, and together we continued walking toward the future, no longer guided by fear or uncertainty, but by trust, respect, and the understanding that the greatest love stories are not defined by how easily they begin. They are remembered because two ordinary people choose kindness, patience, and honesty every single day until those choices quietly become the life they always hoped to build together.